Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 27 May 2025. It is the 112th anniversary of the birth of Jesse Glenn Gray, better known as J. Glenn Gray, who was born in rural Mifflintown, Pennsylvania, on this date in 1913. Gray studied German philosophy, and his short book from 1941, Hegel's Hellenic Ideal, was based on his dissertation at Columbia University. This has also been published under the title Hegel and Greek Thought, and I highly recommend the book, especially for its discussion of the works of the younger Hegel. It is the clearest exposition of Hegel's early theological works of which I know. Martin Wilsner says that the same day Gray received the notice of his doctorate in philosophy in the mail, he also received his call-up notice. He was drafted into the U.S. military for the duration of the Second World War and served as a counterintelligence officer. This was an experience that shaped his life long after his service was over, and it resulted in his writing The Warriors, Reflections on Men in Battle. This book has come to be recognized as a classic of describing and explaining, or at least attempting to explain, the battlefield experience. And it's been included in the Library America volume World War II Memoirs, The European Theater, along with the war memoirs of Charles B. MacDonald, Mary Lee Settle, Elmer Benninger, and James Hardin Daugherty. Gray could be compared, on the other hand, to Ernst Jünger, insofar as Gray and Jünger were both what we could call soldier philosophers. In Jünger's day, the battlefield experience was called the front experience, or Fronterlebnis, and as Gray came to be recognized for his exposition of the Fronterlebnis for Americans during the Second World War, Jünger had been recognized for his exposition of the Fronterlebnis for the Germans during the First World War. We could say that both Gray and Jünger struggled to make sense of their experience as soldiers, as indeed Gray wrote explicitly that this was what he was trying to do. And their struggle to understand their combat experiences found both of them engaging with the most influential philosophy of technology of their time. Specifically, both stand in an important relationship to Heidegger's philosophy of technology, Jünger as an influence on Heidegger, and Gray, in turn, influenced by Heidegger. But the two of them, Gray and Jünger, are nevertheless worlds apart despite their shared experience of combat and their shared relationship to Heidegger. The sense that they ultimately made of their experience of war was very different in each case. I've mentioned before that I'm not a Heidegger enthusiast, so I'm not the right person to give a summary of Heidegger's philosophy of technology. However, we can find something like a sketch of what Gray took over from Heidegger in a profile of Gray by Martin Wilsner, J. Glenn Gray, philosopher, translator of Heidegger, and warrior. This account of Gray is well worth reading. Wilsner calls Gray a reluctant Heideggerian. This seems a little odd to me to call Gray reluctant, given his translation of Heidegger's What is Called Thinking. A translation is usually a labor of love, and this doesn't suggest hesitancy to me. But Gray did write some highly critical pieces on Heidegger as he struggled to come to terms with Heidegger, not unlike his struggle to come to terms with his wartime experiences, but he seems to have been brought round eventually. In a letter to Hannah Arendt, whom he knew personally, as he also personally knew Heidegger, Gray wrote, quote, "If this keeps going, I may one day be an expert, horrible, on Heidegger," unquote. And I guess this does betray some hesitancy. He visited Heidegger many times and consulted with him closely on translations of his works into English. Wilsner, in his profile of Gray, focuses on this Heideggerian influence, reluctant or not, writing of Gray's most famous book, quote, "The Warriors contains at least one substantial Heideggerian residue of which we should take note. It is Gray's examination of what he calls the technological mentality, which comes very near the end of the book. This comportment, which has brought forth the separation of man from nature, leads directly, Gray thinks, to the exploitation of things and people. In this sense, the technological mentality goes hand in hand with an exploitative mentality, one which seemingly affords man control of all things in this world. The impulse to destruction and war is also, in this sense, a symptom of a much broader phenomenon, one rooted in the very core of Western civilization itself. Unquote. The themes here, then, summarized by the sympathetic Woessner and not by me, are the following six. 1. A technological mentality. 2. The separation of man from nature. 3. The exploitation of things and people. 4. Human control or the pretense of human control of all things of this world. 5. An impulse to destruction that follows from human control with an attitude of exploitation. And 6. A deep history of all this at the core of Western civilization. None of this is cast in Heideggerian language, and I think this is probably all for the good. But I note this explicitly because most Heidegger sycophancy makes a great show of using his language or some suitably awkward English coinage with the German original in parentheses. Of the technological mentality, Gray wrote in The Warriors, quote, I have become convinced that the familiar and the evident are so remote because we moderns have increasingly separated ourselves from nature by replacing a primary artistic response to things with a technological mentality, unquote. And Woessner wrote of Gray and Heidegger, quote, agreeing with Heidegger that the modern age is rife with spiritual technological dehumanization, the loss of faith and all sense of direction, Gray wonders in an essay from the early 50s about the fate of man. Paraphrasing Heidegger and returning to a concern he articulated in the conclusion of his own Hegel dissertation, he writes, self-alienation and homelessness have become the fate of millions, unquote. There's nothing particularly new or radical about these ideas. Similar thoughts have been expressed since the technologically driven acceleration of history that followed the Industrial Revolution. We could even say that this view is now so familiar it's become cliché, if not trite. No one is breaking any new philosophical ground by bemoaning the loss of faith, alienation, spiritual homelessness, and dehumanization of modernity. This feeling of separation from nature has driven numerous back to nature and back to the land movements since the Industrial Revolution. Whether we're talking about the Wandervogel in interwar Germany, or hippie communes in the 60s, or cottagecore today, these inevitable responses to the alienation of urbanized and industrialized life are predictable and can be expected to recur periodically as long as the mass of humanity lives in our urbanized and industrialized condition. I don't mean to reduce the work of Gray and Heidegger to a cri de coeur against the industrialized order, but is that in part. So what else is it in addition to that? If the sentiment of spiritual homelessness has become trite and the instinctive rejection of modern alienation is predictable, what do we learn from Gray about the nature of history? The explicit concern with technology, however problematic the technological mentality is believed to be, offers us a distinctive perspective on history. Just as we could give an idealistic account of history according to which human history begins when there is an authentic human response to natural occurrences, which is more or less the position of Joseph Pieper, whom I discussed in my previous episode, we could also give a materialist account of history according to which history begins when human technology intervenes in the historical process. A new, or at least an altered historical process comes into being when history is altered by human technologies. The traditional position of history that marked the advent of the historical period in the strict sense as coincident with the advent of written records is, in a sense, one such materialist account of history, because written language is a technology, and when written language is used to make records, which can later be used to reconstruct the past, then a human technology has initiated history, or we could say it has initiated the kind of history made possible by explicit propositional knowledge about the past. When we think of a materialist account of history, we usually think of Marx, and certainly Marx's influence is overwhelming. But other materialist accounts of history are equally possible, and the materialist account of history that centers history on technology is one such possibility. Gray, following Heidegger, finds this relationship to technology problematic, but our industrialized world with its technological mentality is the fact of our period of history. Technology and the technological mentality constitute our lives whether we like it or not. Our present is defined by technology, by the design and engineering of technology, and by the use of technology. And the present is a theme to which Gray returns repeatedly. In Woessner's profile of Gray that I quoted earlier, Woessner commented on Gray's attitude to the present in relation to Heidegger's thought. Quote, returning to all those themes he had by now been teasing out of Heidegger's work for years, Gray let loose on the monstrous present and all that it represented, unquote. This remark about the monstrous present by Gray that Woessner quotes is taken from the following passage by Gray. Quote, I am confident that the struggle to comprehend my experience as a soldier in World War II provides a perspective on past and future that helps to reduce the discontinuities of the monstrous present, unquote. By the discontinuities of the monstrous present, I take it that Gray meant the discontinuity with nature, which I've already touched on, a discontinuity with tradition, and the other discontinuities that follow from modern alienation, or which you could say originate modern alienation. And like the present, the monstrous is another theme that recurs in Gray. Gray alluded to the monstrous in the following, quote, at the University of Hawaii, I heard a Japanese philosopher speak of the monstrous character of modern civilization. He was referring to Japan's adoption of Western science and technology, which has resulted in one of the highest gross national products in the world. At the same time, Japan has become, according to him, the most godless nation of all, with no real motivations other than impulses for material goods and sex. His words were for me more impressive because I learned to know him in a week's association as no Cassandra bemoaning the loss of religious faith and indulging in reactionary nostalgia. Though a serious man, he was anything but gloomy. His lecture and discussion centered on the issue of whether men of the East or West can survive without any god or gods, and his answer to explicit questions about this was an unyielding no, unquote. Throughout The Warriors, Gray repeatedly invokes both the present and the monstrous. For example, concerning the present, he wrote, quote, millions of men in our day, like millions before us, have learned to live in war's strange element and have discovered in it a powerful fascination. The emotional environment of warfare has always been compelling. It has drawn most men under its spell. Reflection and calm reasoning are alien to it. I wrote in my war journal that I was obsessed with the tyranny of the present. The past and the future did not concern me. It was hard for me to think, to be alone. When the signs of peace were visible, I wrote in some regret, the purgative force of danger which makes men coarser but perhaps more human will soon be lost in the first months of peace will make some of us yearn for the old days of conflict, unquote. Perhaps it would have been better for Gray to call this the tyranny of immediacy, since the urgent immediacy of war forces us to live in the present to the exclusion of all else. Failure to do so could well cost a man his life in combat. Also, the mention in this passage of a purgative force that makes men coarser but perhaps more human reminds me of a famous passage from Thucydides, rather more pithy than Gray, who said, quote, war is a stern master. In depriving them of the power of easily satisfying their daily wants, it brings most men's minds down to the level of their actual circumstances, unquote. This puts the tyranny of the present, or the tyranny of immediacy, as I would call it, in a rather different light. Because we all know that a great many men lead lives of pretension, living far beyond the actual circumstances of their life, and Thucydides saw how war largely does away with this pretense. We can then understand why Gray took the next step beyond Thucydides and added that war reducing men to the level of their actual circumstances made them more human. He might just as well have said that war makes people less phony, and this is something that we may miss when it's gone. I said that Gray and Younger were worlds apart despite their shared experiences, but Gray's suggestion that war as a purgative force is strangely similar to a line from Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto of 1909, which anticipated so much of the 20th century. And this demonstrates a surprising coincidence between the two despite their differences. The ninth item of the Futurist Manifesto is this, quote, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world. Militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of the anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and contempt for woman." Unquote. Another translation of the same calls war the world's only hygiene. The Futurist Manifesto is at the same time a celebration of technology. The violently anti-traditional yet technologically enthusiastic Marinetti wrote, quote, "We affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes, like serpents of explosive breath. A roaring car that seems to ride on grape shot is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." Unquote. The idea of war as a purgative was shared by Marinetti, Younger, and Gray, though each of them framed it differently, each of them reacted to it differently, and each of them differently evaluated the experience based on their reactions. Younger, like Marinetti, glorified technology, but above and beyond that, he glorified what technology would make mankind become. In his essay, Total Mobilization, which was a strong influence on Heidegger, and his book, The Worker, which expanded on the themes of total mobilization, he looked forward to an entire society transformed by the forces of industrialization and warfare. Gray has nothing in him of Younger's interwar views, and while the idea of war as a purgative that strips away pretensions is there, Gray reacted against technology and used the resources of Heidegger's philosophy of technology to do so. So much for the present in Gray. I said previously that Gray repeatedly returns to the themes of the present and the monstrous. Concerning the monstrous, Gray quotes Ernst Younger, quote, "The monstrous desire for annihilation, which hovered over the battlefield, thickened the brains of men and submerged them in a red fog. We called to each other in sobs and stammered disconnected sentences. A neutral observer might have perhaps believed that we were seized by an excess of happiness." Unquote. Since Gray's theme was war and men in battle, it's not surprising that he should write of the monstrous, nor is it surprising that he would quote Younger, who, like Gray, made his literary reputation by writing plainly about the experience of battle. Of the experience of battle, Gray makes an interesting observation in The Soldier's Relation to Death. Quote, "In mortal danger, numerous soldiers enter into a dazed condition in which all sharpness of consciousness is lost. When in this state, they can be caught up into the fire of communal ecstasy and forget about death by losing their individuality, or they can function like cells in a military organism, doing what is expected of them because it has become automatic. It is astonishing how much of the business of warfare can still be carried on by men who act as automatons, behaving almost mechanically as the machines they operate." Unquote. Both Younger and Gray are describing altered states of consciousness that are experienced and exhibited in combat, though interestingly, they focus on very different states of consciousness. Younger described what he called a red fog of combat, while Gray described the behavior of automatons. I don't think that we describe Younger's red fog as the condition of an automaton. It sounds, on the contrary, like something human, all too human, something like the antithesis of the experiences of an automaton, if indeed an automaton has any experiences at all. And I don't think that we describe Gray's automatonism as a monstrous desire for annihilation. On the contrary, an automaton desires nothing. An automaton is, in a sense, a philosophical zombie. But both Gray and Younger mention a state that either is ecstatic or can be mistaken for ecstasy. I should say that I'm not trying to find a contradiction between the accounts of Younger and Gray. The point is that both are trying to describe the experience of combat, and this experience may well be ineffable, though I'd prefer to say that it's ineffable as of yet. But the concepts and the language may yet be found someday to express what is now beyond the ability of our conceptual framework to grasp epistemically or conceptually, you could say. Following Wilhelm Dilthey, what both are trying to, we could say that both are trying to express the lived experience of combat. And this lived experience diverges from the understanding of combat by those who have possessed no experience, lived experience of it. And it probably diverges from experience recollected after the fact, even for those who once had the lived experience. We could elaborate a bit on Dilthey and develop the idea that some lived experiences don't greatly diverge from whatever non-lived experience is. Let's call it mediated experience, since it's experience mediated by recollection or by being related by another. While some lived experiences likely do seem to greatly diverge from mediated experience. This divergence between lived experience and its other, mediated experience, or the absence of such a divergence, might someday admit of quantification and might define a continuum stretching from absolutely unmediated experience that is purely ineffable to lived experience that is perfectly rendered in mediated experience and is exhaustively known whether lived or not. Is this an aspect of epistemic capture where concept formation is either adequate or inadequate to the object being thematized as knowledge, and so someday might be amenable to better concept formation? Or is this a matter of an intrinsic property of lived experience that cannot ever be represented conceptually? Both could be true at different points of the continuum that stretches between the divergence of lived and mediated experience on the one hand, and on the other hand, to the convergence of lived and mediated experience. This would be an interesting thread to follow up with more care and greater detail at another time, though. If the experience of combat and the phenomenon of warfare can help us to shed light on this way of conceptualizing the epistemic problem of philosophy, then we have good reason to pay more attention to the philosophy of war. I've said many times that philosophy of war is a close cousin of philosophy of history, and Gray, we could say, took up the war side of this relationship. To the cousins of war and history, we can also add the further cousins of civilization and religion, with the four of them, war, history, civilization, and religion, standing in relationships of mutual implication and incapable of being perfectly isolated one from the other. It's worth reflecting on how altered states of consciousness, such as those described by Younger and Gray, have played a prominent role both in war and religion. And these are principal shapers of history and civilization, so that much of human history is the product not of our ordinary state of mind, not a product of tranquility and calm contemplation, not the product of mediated experience and propositional knowledge, but rather a product of lived experience, and especially of extreme experiences in which human beings do things, say things, and believe things that would strike them as absurd in more composed and rational moments of life. I don't think we've yet come to grips with this, that history is made in extremis, as it were, and must be understood as having been made by men in altered states of mind. The philosophical attempt to understand history in the form of philosophy of history, be it analytical or speculative, is predicated upon a rational grasp of events. And it's a fair question whether a rational grasp of events can do justice to history being made in extremis. I'm not suggesting that the theoretical frame of mind is incapable of understanding or appreciating altered states of consciousness, be they states of consciousness of soldiers in battle or states of consciousness of men involved in religious ritual. This kind of claim is easy to make, a kind of cheap shot, as it were, at the philosophers who wrestled mightily with these and other mysteries of the human condition. We could well say that they've failed despite their efforts, but not for lack of trying, and philosophy even has the occasional success to boast about. There are moments of clarity when we grasp what Descartes called clear and distinct ideas, and moments of penetration when we pierce beneath the surface and get to the heart of the matter in one decisive thrust. That is to say, there are moments when successful concept formation is possible, and this concept formation dispels the apparent ineffability of some forms of lived experience. We need to assemble a great many more of these moments to make sense of history, but we have to start with the few that have been vouchsafed to us so far. So happy birthday, Glenn Gray, and thanks for listening.